program here at CSIS. One of the most active areas that we've been involved in the Americas program over these last 3 years has been the Northern Triangle in Central America and ongoing efforts to address high levels of corruption and violence in these countries, factors that clearly are pushing migration from these countries. One of the most important and effective initiatives to promote greater transparency and to attack corruption in two of these countries, Guatemala and Honduras, have been the international commissions set up in cooperation with the UN and the Organization of American States to fight corruption and strengthen judicial institutions, CICIG in Guatemala and MACCIH in Honduras. Together with the American University's Center for Latin American and Latino Studies, we decided to organize this morning's presentation to contribute to a broader understanding of these two innovative institutions, their successes, and some of the problems that they have encountered. MACCIH and CICIG have had measured successes in confronting corruption, so much so that entrenched political and economic interests in these countries in recent years have been doing everything they can to undermine the institutions and most recently to prevent the renewal of their mandates. Before turning the panel over to Mark, I wanted to share with you the strongest argument that I have heard in favor of the critical role that can be played by these international commissions. I heard this reasoning from a very serious business leader from the region who made the following argument. We can accept the role of international institutions like CICIG and MACCIH and thereby cede a small degree of sovereignty temporarily to these institutions, or we can do as we've done in recent decades and cede our sovereignty to the forces of international drug trafficking and organized crime, as we in fact have done. This argument keeps coming back to me when we consider the role of MACCIH and CICIG. Our panel discussion this morning will be moderated by Mark Schneider, who is a senior advisor here at CSIS with a very distinguished career that he began as a Peace Corps volunteer in El Salvador a few years ago, and which included many other senior positions in government and civil society, including as Assistant Administrator for Western Hemisphere for USAID, Director of the Peace Corps, and Senior Foreign Policy Advisor to Senator Edward Kennedy. There are few individuals in this country who know the Northern Triangle as well as Mark. Mark, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Michael. And it gives me great pleasure to open this discussion of two of the more innovative, as Michael indicated, attempts to help fragile states in Central America confront deep-seated, historical, corrupt networks. In the same way that we saw an international response to prevent the takeover of Colombia by an armed insurgency 2 decades ago, we need to think how the international community best supports those committed to democratic institutions and the rule of law in fragile states, in Central America, but in general. Now, two of those efforts are CICIG, the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, and MACCIH, the mission of the OAS support for against impunity in Honduras, countries where the pattern of state capture has been increasingly clear since the end of civil conflicts in Central America nearly 3 decades ago. In Guatemala, corrupt linkages between criminal organizations and members of the political elite became impossible to hide this year when a presidential candidate was arrested by U.S. authorities in Miami for seeking campaign financing from the Sinaloa drug cartel, as well as in killing his major opponents. His promise in exchange was to allow them to pick the next ministers of defense and security. However, this arrest was only the latest evidence of such illicit linkages that CICIG and the country's Attorney General, year after year, had uncovered. We'll hear from our panelists and guests, including the former Fiscal General, former Attorney General Claudia Paz y Paz, by Skype from Costa Rica, and her successor, Thelma Adlana, here with us today, what their joint investigations revealed in terms of the extent of such corruption. That corruption has reached into the presidential palace of former President Otto Perez Molina, now on trial for siphoning off tens of millions of dollars from customs revenues and his vice president for doing the same, who's already been convicted and sentenced for the same crime. His successor, Jimmy Morales, also has been the subject of charges of illicit campaign finance filed by the current fiscal general. In Honduras, corruption has become near synonymous with the current administration there after President Juan Orlando Hernandez's brother was arrested and is undergoing trial in the U.S. for drug trafficking. The president himself was reportedly described by DEA as a subject of interest. Several of the same characteristics, slightly different, were apparent in El Salvador in terms of state capture. That was when violent actors, particularly the MS-13 and Barrio 18 gangs, essentially controlled multiple municipalities several years ago through extortion, corruption, and violence. At the time, the country then had the highest rate of homicides per capita in the world outside of countries at war. There's been a significant reduction in El Salvador in the rate of homicides with exemplary programs. I should add that both the USAID and the State Department just have helped promote. Those programs, I think, would continue under the current administration if U.S. funding is not curtailed. And that's a major issue now as a result of President Trump's decision to halt all aid to the 3 Central American countries. The bulk of the populations in all 3 countries are desperate for greater security in their homes, on the streets, and in their businesses. The weakness of the rule of law is a key contributor to migration from the Northern Triangle. And that weakness also is a very significant obstacle to economic progress. U.S. business is leery, and other international business are leery about expansion into a region without the certainty of the rule of law and guarantees of a level playing field so that firms are not faced with unfair competition unless they violate the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Just last week, the State Department issued its investment climate statement for Guatemala, noting that FDI, the foreign direct investment flows, fell 11% last year, and it noted complex and confusing laws and regulations, inconsistent judicial decisions, bureaucratic impediments, and corruption continue to constitute practical barriers to investment. In El Salvador, the same report came out saying political polarization, cumbersome bureaucracy, an ineffective judicial system, and widespread violence and extortion have also contributed to the perception that the investment climate is inadequate. In Honduras, it noted again weak institutions and corruption, high levels of crime, and poor infrastructure. My bias with respect to the role of international, independent mechanisms to strengthen national institutions responsible for the rule of law and for ensuring accountability and governance should be clear from the outset. The U.S. government, through the work of USAID's CARC, through ICITAP, OPTAT, in the Justice Department, initially funded by the USAID and then the State Department, have also bolstered criminal justice systems. However, it is the independence guaranteed by sponsorship through international organizations like the UN and the OAS that has produced greater credibility in the minds of the population. So CICIG, in fact, has over 70% approval in Guatemala, and MACCIH in the polls in May showed that it had over 60% approval from Hondurans. In both countries, those match the highest level of approval for any institution. So the key questions that we hope to answer today are: what are the key attributes of these 2 international mechanisms for supporting justice and the rule of law? And to answer those questions, we have a unique panel. First, we're going to hear from Chuck Cole, Charles Chuck Cole, Associate Professor of International Peace and Conflict Resolution in the School of International Service of American University. He leads a project on international anti-impunity missions in Central America, sponsored by the Seattle International Foundation and the Open Society Foundation. And he has just concluded a really remarkable report on those issues, which he's going to talk about and present today. I'm going to introduce Chuck now and let him make his presentation, and then I will introduce our other panelists, including Arturo Aguilar, Claudia Paz y Paz from Costa Rica, and our final speaker today will be Thelma Aldana, former Fiscal General de Guatemala. Chuck.
Thank you, Mark. Thanks very much for organizing this event jointly with the Center for Latin American and Latino Studies at American University, where I'm a fellow. I'm going to try to be brief, partly because Claudia Paz y Paz can only be with us for a short time this morning. And so I'm going to be give you some of the highlights, essentially, of this report that I just completed and presented in El Salvador last month. It was specifically, that report was developed with an eye to the Salvadoran audience. I had been in El Salvador earlier and had gotten a flavor of what the concerns were, as the president, who was just sworn in there on June 1st, had made a campaign promise to create a CICIG-like institution for his country. In this particular presentation today, I'm going to be more generic about the lessons that I've drawn from these two experiences based on over 2 years of research that I've been doing on both MACCIH and CICIG. And it's great to be here with such distinguished commentators on these issues. So, first of all, what is unusual about these commissions? There's two things that I think that are crucial about them, and one is that they are hybrid missions, as I like to call them, and as they are called by others, and that is that they have both international mandates and national capacities and mandates, so they're integrated. Peacekeeping operations are generally just international missions, for example, and so technical assistance missions are generally advisory to national institutions and don't have a mandate from an international institution like these do. The other thing that's important about these is that they are consent-based, so that they were created with the consent of the national government at the outset, and under specific terms. Right? And so the CICIG agreement was one that had the status of an international treaty which trumps national law in the hierarchy of laws, which became important as the Constitutional Court has ruled on its validity 3 times, at least in the case of Guatemala and once in the case of Honduras. So the first thing so that's essentially what I think is important to understand about these animals, okay? And lots of other countries have now expressed interest in them, and I think it's important to understand that no one's going to be replicated exactly. Every country is going to adapt these models in the way that they will, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. At the same time, there are certain core things that are important that have been helpful to the success of these. And the first thing I want to say is that they both have pretty historic investigative and prosecutorial achievements. They have brought former and current senior officials to account in ways that are surprising to national citizens in both countries, particularly in Guatemala, where, as most of you probably know, the former president, the former vice president, a sitting vice president, I should say, at the time, as well as cabinet members, military officers, have been indicted and are under arrest. Guatemala, its mandate was to investigate what were known as illegal armed groups, I'm going to call them, by way of translation, and illegal armed security groups, and it has investigated 60 of these groups, dismantled them. 680 people have been indicted, 310 have been found guilty in more than 100 cases. The cases have kept coming since these stats. Just yesterday, a big health corruption case was announced by the Attorney General's office and CICIG in Guatemala, for example. And MACCIH has helped, in a shorter time, have more quick results, in fact, than CICIG did, but maybe with less impact in terms of high-level officials. They've had 12 big cases that they have indicted and have announced. They've indicted, and those include dozens of legislators, as well as the former First Lady, who is now sitting in a prison, much to the consternation of the ruling party, many people inside the ruling party in that country. They've had cases that they've they have done searches of the 2 main parties of the country, something that was sort of unthinkable a few years ago. And I think that the crucial thing about the achievements that these had is that they've done this in conjunction with specifically created units within the Attorney General's office in both countries. Without those specially created, vetted, selected groups, these international missions wouldn't have been able to have the success that they've had. And the future of those units is actually critical for the future of these kinds of investigations in both countries. So the other thing that's crucial, there's some differences between them that I don't want to go into too much detail, but I think it's just important to understand that both of these missions can carry out independent investigations. They can they can select the cases that they are going to investigate. In the case of Guatemala, they can conduct their own investigations without involvement of the public ministry. Over time, since it was created in 2007 and went into action in 2007, CICIG, that's 12 years, it has increasingly worked much more hand in glove with the Attorney General's office, the public ministry in these countries. Initially, it did more independent investigation. Now it does more closely. The case of MACCIH in Honduras, it can only do investigations in conjunction with the national authorities. And of course, these prosecutions, they can work and together in prosecutions, but neither of these missions can prosecute them on their own in these countries. And of course, all these cases go before national courts. This is an important point in terms of the criticism that has been leveled against them, particularly in Guatemala, of an incursion on sovereignty. So all the prosecutions that take place, all the courts and judges that are making decisions are all national in both cases, okay? So, the second of 5 big points I want to make here is that it has not been easy. In both cases, the more success that these missions have had, the more antibodies they have ignited in both these countries. Initially, you had presidents who, for political reasons, wanted to create these bodies, but has their people and their officials, and in some cases, and in the case of Guatemala, they themselves became investigated, then their opposition arose. And particularly since 2016, CICIG has been, a campaign against CICIG has been organized by the president when his family was investigated, by economic elites when they were indicted and began to be investigated. So their initial reticence or implicit support has changed over time. Lobbying firms have been paid millions of dollars here in Washington to oppose these missions in the last 3 years. In the case of Honduras, another important aspect and contribution of these missions is that they make proposals for legal reforms. And in the case of Guatemala, some very important legal reforms for anti-corruption were approved, particularly in the early years. In the case of Honduras, some electoral reforms were approved, but really the Honduran Congress has just not acted on many of the recommendations, and so this is one of the more disappointing elements of the role of that mission in that country. I'm going to move on and to the next point, which is one of the lessons that I think was important, particularly for Central Americans, is that these things take time to get going, and they take time to show results. And so it takes months to negotiate these agreements, months, again, to get them approved by national legislative assemblies, and months to set up physically inside these countries and hire the people that need to be hired and screened. And so it took 2 years for CICIG to begin to secure its first convictions. MACCIH's investigations has only led to 12 public indictments, although many others, dozens of others are being investigated currently inside Honduras, okay? And I think there's been a little disappointment in civil society in Honduras, particularly because civil society wanted a CICIG. They wanted that thing that Guatemala had to get rid of their president. And their standard for many of the people in civil society has been they think that they have a corrupt president, and until that president is indicted, then their satisfaction with MACCIH is not going to be fully satisfied. It's not all of civil society, but much of civil society has had this standard that has been has shaped the public image of MACCIH, despite, as Mark said, the very positive public support that it has. I've already mentioned, so the next point I want to say is that these strong partnerships are essential to the success of these missions. And I've already mentioned one of those partnerships, which is the partnership with the National Attorney General's Office. That has been crucial for the success. The other part of that has been technical capacity building, and I think that has been a contribution, perhaps not as much as it could have been in the case of CICIG, but over time increasingly, and in Honduras, there's been a certain level of capacity building as well. There's two other elements of that relationship that are important, though. It's not just technical. It's actually about helping improve and provide the space for good officials and honest officials who want to do their job honestly, to be able to do their job honestly and not to have the pressures that they experience from either fears that they have about their own security or an ability to withstand bribes and pressure from interests that are trying to undermine investigations, which happens constantly in these environments. The final thing is that CICIG is actually one of its important contributions, which is something that I think is really important, is it helped actually create the atmosphere and the conditions for the selection of really strong attorneys general in the case of Guatemala. Two of whom, Claudia Paz y Paz and Tela Maldana, are going to speak shortly. But I think CICIG was helpful in creating the conditions for the selection of those people who elevated the work of the Attorney General's office. The other element of partnerships that are important is the partnerships with international actors. Both of these missions, part of their independence, as Mark helpfully mentioned, comes from the fact that they don't depend on the national government for their funding. They depend exclusively on international donations. And those donations have been generous and adequate for what is essentially a pretty low-cost investment in a very important mission. And the case of Guatemala, roughly $15 million a year since 2007 is the average budget, roughly, of that mission. It's been a little over half of that in the case of Honduras, which is a smaller mission. And the United States has been the largest donor to both of those since their creation. And those are important partnerships that have continued until recently, in the case of the United States, when under the Trump administration, its reticence about supporting CICIG and some of the actions of CICIG, particularly its sensitivities about seeing CICIG has an incursion on sovereignty, as well as a particular case involving the Bitkovs, a Russian family that had been there, and CICIG, in one of its investigations, came up with a bunch of people who had paid for false documents, including these folks, and these folks had powerful friends in Washington, and they have worked with, and they have highlighted what they consider to be an injustice there, which is puzzling, frankly, to me, in terms of what the work of CICIG has been. The last point I want to make is that these anti-impunity missions are often created sort of under the guise of a technical mission, but in both cases, they've ended up having some pretty important political impacts. And that can be expected of a hybrid international mission like these. They have touched the systems of politics and economics in ways that go beyond judicial processes, and that is precisely why they have become so polarizing and so important. I had a plumber come to my house here in Maryland, and we started chatting as he was under the sink, and he said he was from Honduras. And I said, well, I'm doing some work on this MACCIH thing. This was like 3 months ago. And he said, oh yeah, why do you think Juan Jimenez, the former head of MACCIH, left? And so this guy had been here for 12 years, and he knew the name of the head of MACCIH in Honduras, which for me was just a testament of the kind of profile that an international mission gets that a typical international technical assistance program doesn't get. And that is important for the impact that these missions can have in terms of inspiring both the national officials who are doing their jobs and the public to come forward and give testimony in important cases that are sensitive. Political parties have been shaped by this. The way that legislative financing of campaigns and the corruption that has just been systemic for virtually all the political parties for the last few decades has been exposed, and now political parties are being forced to actually change the way they do funding in order to abide by the law for the first time. And the last thing I'll say is I'm going to go back to a point that Mark said earlier, which is If we're concerned about migration in the United States, if we're concerned about migration, violence is driving much of that, fear and insecurity. And at the core of that fear and insecurity is impunity where justice systems don't work. And these missions have been important and positive experiences for trying to turn around that impunity and curb that impunity, and they have shown in their short amount of time that it can be done, that top officials can be prosecuted and put in jail. So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. And now we're going to hear from Claudia Paz y Paz from Costa Rica, and I'm going to ask, however this is going to be done. Claudia was Guatemala's first female Attorney General, has been Secretary for Multidimensional Security at the Organization of American States. She's a criminal law specialist, scholar, judge, litigator who's worked to strengthen the justice system in Guatemala. She founded the Institute for Comparative Criminal Studies of Guatemala, a human rights organization, in 1994, and she assumed leadership of the Guatemalan Ministerio Público in December 2010 and served until May 2014. And since then, she has been part of OAS investigating missions of disappearances in Mexico and also into the human rights violations in Nicaragua. And so, Claudia, the floor is yours.
Buenos días, Mark. Buenos días a todos allá. Muchas gracias por la invitación y por la oportunidad de compartir lo que construimos trabajando codo a codo con CICIG en el Ministerio Público. Estoy hablando desde Centroamérica porque ahora dirijo el programa para Mesoamérica de CICIG, una organización de derechos humanos. Quizás voy a repetir algunos puntos que ya han tocado ustedes. Cuando reflexiono sobre qué significó el trabajo con CICIG para el sistema de justicia de Guatemala, y pensando en que ahora la barra se pone en que fue capaz de llevar a un presidente en funciones y a su vicepresidenta y parte del gabinete a ser procesados y muchos de ellos ahora condenados. Creo que para poder comprender lo que significó CICIG en Guatemala, tenemos que retrotraernos al momento anterior a que CICIG estuviera en el país. Y es que si pensamos en la Guatemala del 2006, era una Guatemala de la violencia. Teníamos 46 homicidios por cada 100,000 habitantes, ahora tenemos 21.5. Esto significaba una de las tasas más altas del mundo de homicidios y, por supuesto, la mayoría de ellos quedaban en la absoluta impunidad. Había una desconfianza de las organizaciones, de los ciudadanos ante las autoridades, y realmente no había ninguna expectativa de que algún caso se fuera a resolver. Y por este escenario de impunidad, de violencia, de desconfianza, es que un grupo de organizaciones de sociedad civil, defensores de derechos humanos, tuvieron la idea de crear esta organización, se aliaron con parte de la comunidad internacional, con organizaciones en Estados Unidos, en Europa, y luego, pues sí fue posible, se firmó el convenio con Guatemala. Y lo menciono porque la primera tarea que tenía el primer comisionado era, y así lo decía, necesito encontrar un fiscal honesto, deme un fiscal honesto, un juez honesto, y entonces voy a poder hacer mi trabajo. Porque en ese entonces eran organizaciones muy cerradas hacia la sociedad civil, en las que no se creía en su trabajo, y era muy difícil saber por dónde empezar. Y tal cual lo explicó Chuck hace unos minutos, los primeros fueron cambios normativos. Se modificó la ley contra el crimen organizado para tener la posibilidad de condonarle la pena a las personas que fueran colaboradores eficaces. Se implementaron métodos especiales de investigación como las escuchas telefónicas, que aunque estaban durante varios años en la legislación, no se habían puesto en práctica. Y sobre todo, como mencionaba, creo que hace un minuto, se aprobaron leyes contra la corrupción, aumentando las penas de delitos que antes eran privilegiados en el Código Penal, y se tipificaron conductas que antes eran lícitas, como el financiamiento electoral, que ahora es ilícito, y el enriquecimiento ilícito, que antes no era punible. Entonces, si pensamos en la primera época de CICIG, ¿qué aportó? Lo más importante, creo, fueron estas reformas normativas, pero también, y ya fue mencionado, fue la creación de, primero, unidades fiscales específicas. Se aprobó la ley para los jueces de mayor riesgo, lo que permitió que la contraparte judicial de las investigaciones criminales fuera liderado por jueces independientes. Y luego también hubo nuevos nombramientos para fiscal general. Yo fui nombrada en diciembre del 2010, pero también hubo cambio en el Ministerio de Gobernación y en la Corte Suprema de Justicia. Y estas tres nuevas instituciones pudieron trabajar de forma conjunta, generando nuevas y distintas sinergias, cada uno, por supuesto, con su rol, pero todos con el objetivo común de permitir que la ley se aplicara. Si pensara en un segundo grupo de transformaciones que fueron desarrolladas con la presencia de CICIG en Guatemala, creo que una de las más importantes es un método de trabajo diferente. Creo que los pocos casos que se esclarecían, si es que alguno se esclarecía antes del 2017, era de una forma muy reactiva, era de una manera como un caso, una investigación, y eso consumía muchos recursos y realmente impedía observar cuáles eran las redes criminales, fueran pandillas, narcotráfico, redes de corrupción, que estaban detrás de la comisión de los crímenes. Creo que con los primeros casos de CICIG, los fiscales y los policías comenzaron a entender una nueva forma de investigar los delitos, y una forma bastante más proactiva que reactiva y bastante más profunda. Más allá de ver el hecho delictivo en sí, intentar de ver en qué contexto, a qué mercado ilícito responde. Eso permitió que durante los primeros años fuera posible, por ejemplo, investigar redes vinculadas al narcotráfico, y en los últimos años las grandes redes de corrupción y de macrocriminalidad. Y también para poder llevar estas investigaciones adelante se necesitan de nuevos equipos de personas, de nuevas formas de investigar, y CICIG apoyó muchísimo a crear estas otras unidades que antes no existían o existían y operaban de una forma muy, muy débil e inefectiva. Las primeras que ayudó a transformar fue la Oficina para la Protección de Testigos, el Departamento de Seguridad del Ministerio Público, y para mí la joya de la corona, que fue la creación de la Dirección de Análisis Criminal, que es este grupo de personas que no necesariamente son abogados, que tienen la tecnología adecuada para cruzar información, para examinar las coincidencias entre la balística, entre los teléfonos, entre las cuentas bancarias. Y yo creo que eso significó el gran salto cualitativo para poder investigar efectiva y profundamente los grandes casos de corrupción, y ya no depender, porque esa era como una debilidad, ya no depender de la investigación de otros cuerpos externos a la Fiscalía, que podían llevar, como la Contraloría de Cuentas, por ejemplo, que podrían dilatar mucho las investigaciones o incluso desviarlas. Y creo que este fortalecimiento institucional, estas nuevas autoridades, esta nueva forma de trabajo, también provocó un cambio en cultura ciudadana, en la forma en que las y los ciudadanos percibían el trabajo de los fiscales, de los jueces, de los investigadores de CICIG. Y es que por primera vez en el país se comenzó a confiar en las autoridades de justicia. Nunca un juez habría sido pensado como un héroe en el país o una fiscal, nunca. Y de repente, yo lo viví, seguro Telma lo va a explicar, que lo debe haber vivido aún más, como un reconocimiento a nuestro trabajo y sigan adelante, estamos con ustedes. Y es lo que viven y me han comentado también mis compañeros fiscales. De repente, la ciudadanía recobró esa confianza, pero también comenzó a sentir un inmenso aprecio por lo que significaba el Estado de Derecho y la vigencia de la ley, y que había otra forma de resolver los conflictos, de minimizar la violencia, era bastante más efectiva. Sobre todo, y ese creo que es un inmenso legado de CICIG y de la fiscal Telma Aldana, porque los últimos casos que se presentaron, lo que nos develaron es la forma en que el Estado de Guatemala había sido capturado por las élites económicas, por las élites políticas, por el crimen organizado inclusive, que la ineficiencia del sistema de justicia, de la ineficiencia del Estado de Guatemala no era una casualidad o la falta de técnica, tenía un propósito específico y era mantener los privilegios que siempre habían disfrutado estas élites. Y yo creo que ha sido un inmenso legado a los 12 años del establecimiento de la comisión en Guatemala. Solo si lo miramos en las cifras de la reducción de hechos de violencia, que no, y quiero que se me entienda, no todo esto fue hecho por CICIG, pero sí la presencia de CICIG en el país fue la que permitió la transformación del Ministerio Público, del sistema de justicia con los jueces de mayor riesgo y de la policía. Yo termino agradeciendo de nuevo la invitación para compartir con ustedes y la paciencia de permitirme hablar desde San José y por Skype, y les mando un gran abrazo a todos.
Y nosotros todos estamos agradecidos a usted. Hasta pronto, gracias. Ahora vamos a escuchar. Now we're going to hear from Arturo Aguilar, currently the executive director of the Seattle International Foundation, and who directs their mission and focus on contributing to the rule of law and a more equal society, more egalitarian society in Central America. Arturo is a human rights defender, researcher, and political strategist who worked more than 20 years in the defense of justice and democracy. He was the main political advisor to Ivan Velasquez, head of the International Commission Against Impunity in Guatemala, and has also been key in working on those issues related to strengthening the capacity of the Guatemala justice institution. Prior to that, Arturo was the Secretary of Strategic and Private Affairs for the Attorney General of Guatemala, Claudia Paz y Paz, and he is an attorney, a notary in Guatemala with a master's degree in Rafael Landivar University. And he, at the age of 18, I thought it important to mention that he worked in the Office of Human Rights of the Archdiocese of Guatemala, which helped to solve the murder of Bishop Juan Jose Gerardi. And worked with the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights in Guatemala, where he trained and advised indigenous peoples' organizations in strategic and constitutional litigation. Arturo.
Here. ¿Se puede? Yeah. Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the invitation. First, hard to follow after the AG, right? She knows everything. But a couple of things that she didn't mention. She mentioned the entire technical side of the spectrum. If you were to see my notes, it's basically the same roadmap, because it's basically what happened. It's basically the truth of the what I call the three periods of the presence of CICIG in Guatemala. The first period with Comisionado Castrejana was the strengthening of the laws and the entire law system that allowed for 7-8 years later to big cases, in order for big cases to be developed. The second stage of CICIG was the strengthening of the public ministry, the Attorney General's offices. Claudia mentioned 2 or 3 of the biggest units in the public ministry, who served later under the mandate of Comisionado Iván Velázquez as the key partners in the Guatemalan institutions to, again, be able to develop these big cases. And the third stage, which Claudia didn't mention a lot about, is the stage that I meant, as I call, the investigative and prosecutorial final stage. And that meaning the time where Commissioner Velázquez had CICIG, and when he was able to harvest and use the laws that were approved 6-7 years later, and then be able to coordinate directly with several of the units of the public ministry in order for big cases like the case that it's called La Línea en Español, the line, the case that landed the sitting president and the sitting vice president in jail, Otto Pérez Molina and Roxana Valdetti, in order for those types of cases to be able to be presented before the courts. Just to mention, that case, Caso La Línea, is the evidence. That case has everything. It has videos, it has audios, it has documents, it has photography, it has everything. But regarding the wiretaps, and only in that case, 97,000 calls were analyzed. And a call can be 30 seconds long, or it can be 15 minutes long. So that's a lot of work. And over 900,000 documents were processed in that case alone. So, in that sense, if the unit that Claudia mentioned, Dirección de Análisis Criminal, that's the Direction of Criminal Analysis. It's the BAU of the Guatemalan criminal justice system. If that unit wouldn't be in place with the know-how, with the skill set, and with the technical hardware and software needed, that case would be able to be presented or constructed in any way, because it's too much. You need a small army of people to work those sort of macro cases. So I'm going to piggyback off the comment of La Línea to say that in the political sense, what I understand about the view and the sense of what the Attorney Generals, both Attorney Generals and Commissioner Velázquez did regarding the prosecutorial policy in Guatemala in the past 5 years, I would call it an evidence-driven prosecutorial policy. And I'm going to explain why using La Línea. When we developed that case, the case resulted in huge amounts of evidence. And if some of you had worked in putting together a case, you know that you only use some percentage of the information in order to present it before the judges, right? So a lot of information remains in possession of the prosecutorial body, in this case, the public ministry, right? And that information led to the creation of a whole new different set of cases. So Caso La Lima was presented in 2015. And then, with that information, the public ministry and CICIG followed the leads and created the cases of 2016, even bigger cases, right? Several of them, and one regarding the public health system, one regarding illicit political finance of the campaign where Otto Pérez Molina was elected president, and several really big cases. And then, with the evidence found in the investigations of the cases of 2016, then CICIG and the public ministry followed the lead the leads to even bigger cases in 2017, right? So you go deeper and deeper into what you can name the heart and soul of illicit networks in Guatemala. Illicit networks that have a root in the political system and that have a root in the economic system, how the economic system works in my country. Yeah, that's the first idea, evidence-driven prosecutorial policy. And the second one that I wanted to mention is a lesson learned, and piggybacking again on Chuck's comment. What has CICIG left in these years in Guatemala, besides what we already know, the big cases and people in jail and everything, and being in the news every day and everything? And just a comment about that before I go into the second idea. Being in the news, I think it comes not from the thirst of spotlight from these institutions, meaning the public ministry and CICIG, but from thirst of justice from these societies. These societies waited 30, 40, 50 years in order to see some justice done. When justice finally came, I'm talking about Honduras and my country, Guatemala, people just were so happy. And you could see it in 2015 in Honduras and in Guatemala, where people took the streets in the most peaceful way possible to express their concern for the lack of rule of law, to express their concerns for corruption now being seen as what it is, as the system, not as an anomaly, but as the system. And then justice starting to shift from being an anomaly to start to be in the system, as it should be in a rule of law state. Right? So going back to the second idea, that's the rule of law. I always kid around a little bit that in my country, we don't have a law-abiding citizenship. We have a non-law-abiding citizenship, and we pride on that. And we used to, as a society, in every sense. And people that are fortunate enough from my country to come to the US, then they go back and kid around that now, you see, when you go to the US, you transform into a different human being. You don't throw the trash in the street. You wait for the light in order to cross the street or to drive, and you don't cross a red light when you're driving. You become a different type of citizen, and that's because the context is really, really different. And because there is a strong word behind it, and that is consequences. Because you're aware that you're going to have consequences. And that is the legacy, I think, that CICIG and MACCIH and all of these efforts can live in my country or in other countries in Central America. The new conscience of being a subject or being, in any time, being put before a court or being put before a prosecutor, so being conscious that consequences can happen and will happen if you don't obey the law. And as I see it, is the beginning of a cultural and societal transformation in my country. Just the beginning of the beginning, because that takes generations, right? But at least you can finally see the light and you can hear the conversations that say, no, that's the way we used to do it, but now we're learning to do it in a different way. And in my sense, that is what will not and cannot be taken away from the Guatemalan society after all of this is over. And you can see it now in Guatemala. For example, there was very recently, the government of Guatemala was trying to buy airplanes from another country, and society in general just said, why are you buying planes? We're not at war, we're not going to be at war, and people don't have a public health system, don't have a public education system. Redirect the money to there. So there is not only a conscience of the need to have a law-abiding culture in the society, but now there's a conscience that if you want that, you need to chip in, you need to participate. And that, I think, is one of the most important and key points that all of these efforts and all of this pain and all of this suffering and all of this sacrifice is going to lead to my country. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you very much. I'm going to follow up on that last point to ask both of you. Clearly, there has been a beginning to change the mindset in both countries so that there are no longer los intocables, that even the most powerful potentially are at risk if they violate the law. And I want to ask both of you, does that change if, as we know, the current government in El Salvador, in Guatemala, has decided not to extend CICIG beyond September? So unless something is done as a result of the current presidential election there, next year CICIG will no longer exist. And in Honduras, the mandate for MACCIH runs out the end of December of this year. So my question is, do you both think that the changes, the beginning of changes in the cultural assumptions in these countries about the rule of law and about accountability will be lost?
Please.
I think it's hard to say. I think the way you said it at first was a good way of saying, which is that the certainty of impunity has ended in Guatemala. The certainty of impunity has ended, I think, in Honduras for now. And I think there's still a lot of impunity. That doesn't mean, there's still a lot of corruption. It's still part of the way things are done. And so you don't want to overstate how much things have changed. But the field has changed, as Claudia Paz and Arturo both described in the case of Guatemala very eloquently. How much can that be rolled back? And I think there's a lot of fear of that, as most of you know, and has been mentioned earlier. CICIG will end in September. It is neither of the two final candidates for the Guatemalan presidency has indicated that they support a renewal of its mandate. And the MACCIH will end in January. When its term is up, unless a renewal is approved by the government and the OAS, which is still possible. But I think, let's assume they go away. And if they do, I think that there was already in Guatemala, when I was there last month, a perceptible sense that things have changed in the last year even. People are making actually accusations without foundation. And so the rule of law is being misused in many cases by the system to bring charges against people who are fearful that they're going to be put in jail for different things. And so that's part of the dynamic that's changing, and so there's a fear that the gains are going to be misfired and misused in a way that actually undermines the gains that have been achieved. I think that the other thing is that that there can always be another administration that will come in later, though, that might actually hold people to account. And I think that is one of the things that's lasting about both of these situations. I think people are very, as I mentioned, disillusioned in Honduras about the inability to get the president who has been implicated in documents in New York federal courts in very minimal ways, mentioned but not implicated, I should say, although his brother and his late sister have both been implicated, and his brother is under indictment here in the States and in jail. And so I think that that frustration coexists with a sense that maybe more is possible.
Arturo.
Thank you, Mark. I think the lesson learned here is that you have to fight for democracy and for justice. And the invitation is for citizens to participate and to engage, because for CICIG, it's a great tool, and it's a great example of how you can shift or start to shift the way things happen and people think. But the responsibility at the end of the day is, well, it's ours, it's of the Guatemalans. And we need to be conscious of that, and we need to, the progress that we all celebrated in 2015 and 2016, people have to be very conscious that if they don't participate and if they don't engage, it will fade away. It will happen in Guatemala. Because as Chuck said, of course there's a lot of impunity and there's a lot of corruption still in Guatemala. What we have now is a way of combating it. But you need to know that justice doesn't happen like a magic act. There are people behind it, there are processes behind it, there are a lot of hours and sacrifice behind delivering justice for everybody in a country. And the civil society and every member of society, citizenship, accompanying the people that are in the forefront of that fight, that's really a completely necessary. That's one idea. And the second idea, in my country, a few years back, we inverted the incentive and the sanction system, the social incentive and sanction system. Before, if you were to be in government, people expected for you to rise up in the chain of the socio-economical pyramid. That's it, to get enriched illicitly. That was given if you went into government. And people naturalized that reality in my country. After all of this, that system has been, it's going slowly back to what it should be, right? So I think the fight now is for us to be very aware of that sanction and incentive system. You have to be very aware not to let the system sanction the people that have fought for justice and that had given their lives for several years and have devoted themselves to fight for justice and to fight impunity in my country. If we let the system go back and to incentive corruption and to sanction the people fighting it, then I will be very, very worried.
I'm going to ask Chuck, let me just say, that last point about the sanctions and how the system operates in government is why the CSIS last year, one of the things that we found was that the issue of civil service reform sounds technical, but it's absolutely crucial in terms of whether or not government functions for the citizens of the country. And all three countries, the civil service system goes back to the 60s, and the lack of reform is a current obstacle to moving forward in terms of greater representation, greater accountability, and greater justice for those three countries. Chuck, let me ask you this. You've been assessing the strengths of CICIG and MACCIH recently in this report, thinking about what are the key attributes that would most help El Salvador as it moves forward in the discussions about how it's going to strengthen its own system of justice. You want to talk about what some of those attributes you think might be most useful in terms of Salvador's moving forward?
Yeah, I think, I mean, in the report, which is available online at our Center for Latin American Studies website at American University.
You might want to, that is www.
Yes, well, I don't know what the www thing is. So, if you just Google AU CLAL, CLALS, MACCIH, it comes
there
up.
you go.
That's how I get to it. So, we have the report there. So one of the things that we found in the report is I mean, we examined sort of the pros and cons of the affiliation with an international organization, right? I think that basically the pros of being affiliated with an international organization are clear, and I think that would be helpful. There's the President Bukele has been articulating this, consistently. So that's one element, right? That it's instead of having a mission such as Ecuador just created an international commission against corruption. It's a panel of international experts who have very solid reputations, but it's not backed, so it's obviously consent-based, but it's not backed by an international organization. And so its ability to influence that government is a little diminished in terms of its weight, for example, by contrast. The second thing is this important power of carrying out investigations that I think is really important and has been important in the case of CICIG. Having access to documents, all case documents, all documents in investigations and of public institutions. Having an ability to propose reforms to laws. That's proven very important in terms of the wiretapping powers, in terms of access to documents that might be protected by state secrecy under certain circumstances, which continues to be a problem in Honduras that the UFECIC just tweeted about yesterday, for example. The UFECIC is the Honduran special unit within the prosecutorial office that works with MACCIH. And I think the other thing that I didn't mention enough, I think, in my remarks is the relationship with civil society. And I think civil society was in the streets, as Arturo mentioned, in 2015 in Honduras, that's why we have a MACCIH, because people were in the streets demanding change and demanding action and demanding, frankly, the head of the president. And this was a way for the president to save his presidency. And that role is important in terms of maintaining that pressure, maintaining oversight, maintaining accountability, and continuing to be basically a source of both pressure on the international mission, but also a source of support and pressure on the government and the legislature to continue to support independent investigations into mega corruption, right? So those are some of the things I would say.
Okay, I'm going to open it up for questions in just a second. I have one more question, which I promised myself that I would ask. Arturo, you served as Chief of Staff to the Attorney General of your country, and you served as Chief of Staff to the Commissioner for CICIG. Which was the best job?
It's a hard question.
Claudia's not on the line anymore.
Oh, yeah, so it's hard. No, I see myself as a very lucky person. I've been able to learn a lot from these two persons, Claudia Paz y Paz and Iván Velázquez. And it's been an honor, and it's been a lot of fun to serve my country under both. So yes, it's fun, 8 years of fun.
All right, the other last question I want to ask both of you is clearly, you've mentioned it, and we've seen a rising tide of those in both countries who have been subject to investigations to go after the reform movement, to in the case of Guatemala, seek to throw out CICIG, to go after the leaders within the reform movement, to go after the former attorney generals, etc. And in Honduras, the parliament has actually voted laws aimed at restricting the capacity of the attorney general and MACCIH, and argued strongly to get rid of MACCIH and not to extend it. So what's your sense, both of you, as to what might be done to counter the counter-revolution?
That's a great question, and it brings us to what I think is, I mean, what's not sort of maybe present enough in this room is exactly this sense of contention that exists about CICIG in Guatemala. It's really, being attacked on a pretty consistent basis by powerful people. And it's also had a lot of critics within the U.S. Congress more recently, because I think so the first thing that I think is necessary is something that we're doing already, which is to provide independent analysis of these institutions so that you have some factual basis on which to understand what they've done and what their shortcomings are. And they do have some shortcomings, but really I think the positive contribution much outweighs those shortcomings. I think a lot of the criticism is unfair, right, that you see against CICIG, and it is, so that's without going into more detail, I'll say that. I think that again, civil society has partner in these countries and in other countries that are considering such a thing is really vital for the ongoing success and understanding of an international mission. I think careful consideration of the mandate and communication about the mandate is something that could have been done better in both of these countries and should be done better in any country that's undertaking such a mission in the future, as well as creating realistic expectations about that. But you know, I find it curious. I'm sitting here and I was listening to Claudia Paz talk about, I was moved by how she talked about how judges and prosecutors are now seen, had never been seen as somebody who were heroic figures. And she has, as well as all three of the people sitting up here, not everybody in the anti-corruption movement has this background, but all of us come from human rights backgrounds. And we started off working on human rights 20 or 30 or 40 years ago.
50, some of us.
Okay, 50. And I think what's interesting is to see the kind of passion that this issue is inciting among people who feel that thirst for justice that Arturo mentioned. And 30 or 40 or whatever years ago, that thirst for justice took the form of clamor for human rights. And today we see people, average citizens, who are clamoring for justice around these issues. And I think tapping into that, mobilizing that, is actually the most crucial thing. And I think if Guatemala and Honduras can preserve that sense of judges and prosecutors and police as heroic figures, then I think that would be an important thing.
Arturo?
Thank you. Yeah, it's the same basic principle. Guatemalan democracy and Honduran democracy belongs to Hondurans and Guatemalans. And it is upon us to defend the progress. And for example, if you review every poll being done on CICIG's approval ratings, inside of Guatemala, it's 70, 75, 80% of approvals. So we live in democracies. So the majority of Guatemalans believe that CICIG has done a good job, and they approve of the job that CICIG has done. So the invitation is to learn what was very good from that experience, what was good and what wasn't, and learn from that and move forward as Guatemalans on defending the progress, and that's meaning the institutions, the people, the laws that were put in place and that were on the forefront of this fight, right? And to defend also this system of sanctions, as Claudia mentioned and as Chuck was mentioning, it is impressive to see when Claudia Paz y Paz or Tel Maldana walk the streets of Guatemala. They're rock stars, and they are actually, but they are rock stars, actual rock stars. They go and they work the streets, and people stop them. Can I take a selfie? Can I? I admire your work. Can I take another selfie? Can I get an autograph? Yeah, just like rock stars, right? And that in my country would have never, ever. You could ask people before all of this, who's the Attorney General of your country? Nobody knew, not even the name. And he's one of the most powerful public officials in the Guatemala system, right? So to engage, that's the invitation. And I think that's the only way to preserve what has been done in the past years. Citizens must engage and must remain engaged for several years in their own capacity.
Great, thank you. On that note, I want to open it up for questions from the audience before we hear finally from Tel Maldana to close our session. But first, questions. We have a question here in front. Here.
Okay, thank you.
Here. Mike.
Oh, sorry about that. Thank you, Francisco Villagran. I'm a retired...
Oh, your name. Embajador.
Francisco Villagran, retired Guatemalan diplomat. I have a question for Chuck and Mark, only because you're in Washington and you follow U.S. foreign policy up closely.
He has made enormous progress with respect to strengthening the rule of law and supporting the Fiscal General and Ministerio Público in Guatemala. I don't think there's any question about that. The opposition that you've mentioned does exist in some quarters, particularly, I would say, on the political side of those in government, and I think mistakenly, because I believe that their concerns, in fact, with respect to migration and other issues, whether it's sovereignty, et cetera, they don't understand that CICIG is the strongest tool for addressing the conditions that result in increased migration and that result in criminal networks being able to maintain their roots and strength and presence in Guatemala. And I think that that's why I think Chuck's point about, and Arturo's, that what needs to be done is that their actual progress and achievements need to be better understood and explained and communicated.
I'm just going to comment particularly on MACCIH and the Honduran situation. To date, I think the distinctions between MACCIH and CICIG, the government, the Trump administration has had a different approach, and it has not been negative actually at all about MACCIH. And so Kim Breyer, who's the Assistant Secretary for Western Hemisphere Affairs, was in Honduras a couple months ago and said she supported the work of MACCIH. The chargé, Heidi Fulton, for the last 3 years has consistently said that she supports the work of MACCIH and the UFECIC, the special unit within the Honduran prosecutor's office that has also come under attack. And I think that maybe there's an optic there that seems that I think there's a real concern about sovereignty. I mean, there's just what I call sovereigntism is spreading around the world, and there's a misperception in my view that this is somehow an incursion on sovereignty. This was particularly true at the U.S. mission to the UN, which saw this as something that which is already an anti-multilateral kind of administration that we have, is very gets jittery when international organizations do things that don't respond directly to what the United States government or member states think they should be doing immediately. And so I think that's a little bit of what's happening, but I don't see that negative attitude happening with MACCIH, and I think the embassy has been very supportive, and financially as well as politically.
Arturo.
I'm just going to quote former ambassador, former INL head, William Brownfield. One of his trips to Central America, he said, CICIG and these mechanisms is the best investment I've done in the past 15 years. If you want a bang for your buck, look at these mechanisms.
Yeah. There is a question here.
Yeah, hi, Keith Slack. I'm with Earth Rights International. We're a human rights organization here in Washington. I want to push a little more on this question in terms of what could have been done to address Trump administration support for CICIG. Could more have been done to try to educate the administration, skeptical members of Congress about what the institution was doing, what its role was, the positive results it was having, how it was actually contributing to addressing some of these factors that are contributing to migration coming to the United States? Or was it essentially a lost cause from the beginning with this administration? And then what sort of lessons for future initiatives of this type can we take from that in terms of, should there be an overt political strategy, some sort of a lobbying campaign with the U.S. government, with other donors, to explain specifically what the institutions do?
Yeah, I mean, I personally think that those who supported CICIG from the beginning mistakenly believed that the factual basis of their achievements with the Fiscal General in Guatemala was on its face obvious. And so when the first attacks came about the specific case involving the Bitkoffs, no one saw that as necessarily a major issue. And in fact, at that point, there needed to be a full-scale effort at educating and explaining how the case came about and the broader set of achievements that we've heard in terms of institutional changes to strengthen the system of justice in Guatemala and the actions that have been taken over the years to address these illicit networks which had increasingly powerful influence over government actions in Guatemala.
I don't have anything to add. So no. Next
We
question.
have here another question. Senior diplomat and knowledgeable expert on Guatemala, Franklin.
Thank you, Frank LaRue.
Identify yourself.
can sit down.
Identify yourself, sir.
Yes, Frank LaRue. Actually worked in the origins of CICIG and currently representative of Fundamedios in Washington. Just to take it further, I think that the problem did not originate in CICIG because everyone recognizes the success of CICIG was whatever we can criticize, but CICIG has, as Arturo was mentioning in the quote, been the most successful initiative that has been proposed in Guatemala. And by the way, an initiative that came out of civil society, which I think is important to rescue this factor. It was civil society that suggested it to the ombudsman, to the Procurador de Derechos Humanos, our ombudsman at a moment, to suggest to the government that then negotiated with the UN. But interestingly enough, I don't think anyone was looking at CICIG and mistakes of CICIG. There were excuses like the Bibkov case, because actually they did buy false papers and the investigation was not on them, was on the sale of false documents of immigration, so over there. So that was a legitimate investigation. But if you look at the fact that President Trump was going to meet with President Morales this weekend, this Monday, after he had purchased illegally, which was then suspended, but purchased illegally airplanes in Argentina at an overprice. So you have a lame duck president leaving, committing the worst cases of corruption, being stopped by his own courts and by his own Controller General, the Contraloría de Cuentas, and still invited to visit the White House. One wonders that what prevailed here was the personal interest of the White House and the dealings with President Morales beyond anything else. And CICIG was never really in the design of foreign policy. So I think this is something to make a reflection with Congress, because this is something Congress can correct with a bipartisan perspective of these issues, I think, and whether CICIG could still be somehow rescued. I agree with Arturo that the main responsibility is of Guatemalans to defend democracy. This is true. But democracy is always defended with partnerships. And the international partnership, not only with the US, but with the UN and the European Union and others, is crucial at this stage of Guatemala. Otherwise, it will mean an enormous slip back to the past and back to the old regime and to the cancellation of the legislation that was enacted before.
Okay. We're going to take one more question. That was not a question, that was a very good comment. We're going to take one more question. And while we're doing that, if somebody can move the podium so that our final speaker can make her comments, I appreciate it. Who made the question?
I have it. Hi, Robert Thomas. I'm an anti-corruption reporter for MLEX. My question revolves around international cooperation with other prosecutors. The big example that comes to mind is Lava Jato, but there are others. You mentioned the U.S. prosecutions. So the question is, would the lapse of these commissions change the nature of international cooperation with other prosecutors in any way, or has a foundation been laid that will allow the sharing of evidence, this cooperation to continue?
Sure. I think there's a trend now, and it has to do more with the political side of it than with the technical side of it. There is a demand for justice in these countries now, and now the bar is way higher than it used to be. And citizens now demand their institutions to deliver justice in certain specific areas. Corruption is one of the most sensitive ones. So my guess is that there is political will on the side of the Attorney Generals in Central America, there will be cooperation and international cooperation between different public ministries in the region, and maybe cooperation with the Department of Justice here in the U.S. I know I'm not allowed to speak about specifics, but I know the fluent cooperation between DOJ and in previous years, the Attorney General's office in Guatemala, and the cooperation between DOJ and CICIG in certain specific topics. So I don't see that stopping, but I see that as just a technical part of a bigger picture. What you need to keep is the political will to do it. Because sending a document in order to get information, that's easy. Having the will to send the document to get the information, that's the key issue. And you need to, and citizens are really important to maintain that political will.
Now we're going to hear as our final speaker from Thelma Aldana. We're privileged to have the former Attorney General of Guatemala, who served from 2014 to 2018 as the Fiscal General of Guatemala. She also previously was the President of Guatemala Supreme Court from 2011 to 2012. She has a law degree from San Carlos University, and she was elected President of the Conference of the States Parties to the United Nations Convention Against Corruption in Vienna in November 2017. She's received a variety of awards, and I think that in her book, by the way, Los Retos de la Esperanza, was published in 2013. At one point, the country's electoral tribunal confirmed her candidacy to the presidential election in Guatemala, and that was withdrawn by the electoral tribunal, and that's part of the reason why she's here, based on spurious charges that were brought against her, and also by threats that were made against her, including, as you recall, I mentioned that Mario Estrada, the candidate for another political party for the presidency, was arrested in Miami, and because one of the things that he tried to do was to recruit the Sinaloa cartel to eliminate two of his opponents, one of whom was Thelma Aldana. And so she is here, in a sense, as a result of the threats against her. It is our privilege to have Thelma Aldana, please. Chuck has agreed to translate.
We'll see how I do here. Okay, go ahead.
Muy buenos días. Deseo iniciar agradeciendo
Good morning. I'd
a
like
la
to start
invitación
by thanking CSIS for the invitation to be here
que me realizaron para participar en el cierre de este evento.
and for being here and to help close this event.
Felicitar por la organización de este foro, porque pienso que a Guatemala, más el daño que ha hecho el presidente Jimmy Morales,
Congratulations for this event, because I think the biggest damage that the current President Jimmy Morales has done
se puede agravar con el silencio.
is that you can end things through silence.
Por eso no debemos callar, y por eso este foro es importante hablar siempre
For that, we
de
shouldn't
lo
be
que sucede en
quiet, and
Guatemala.
we should continue with the mission of what we're doing in Guatemala.
A mi juicio, la CICIG es el mecanismo más importante que ha tenido el país con el apoyo de Naciones Unidas.
In my judgment, CICIG is the most important mechanism that the country has experienced with the support of the United Nations.
Yo me atrevería a separar en 4 etapas el funcionamiento de la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad en Guatemala.
I'd go so far as to separate out into 4 stages the success of the experience of CICIG in Guatemala.
Una primera etapa se puede ubicar en la instalación de la comisión a partir de la gestión tan importante de una sociedad civil guatemalteca empoderada.
The first stage is the management and setting up of the mission in the hands of a very empowered civil society in Guatemala.
Definir los términos del acuerdo, lograr el apoyo de Naciones Unidas y de los diferentes países
To
cooperantes.
define the terms of the agreement and to gain the support of the United Nations and to gain the support of the donors.
Importante la participación de sociedad civil, a pesar de que Guatemala estaba saliendo de un conflicto armado interno, uno de los más crueles de América Latina.
And this support from civil society came despite the fact that Guatemala is emerging from one of the cruelest and most violent civil wars in Latin America.
Con cuerpos ilegales de seguridad y aparatos clandestinos de seguridad incrustados en el Estado guatemalteco, los CICIES.
And including that conflict, coming out of that conflict, you had these illegal armed security, clandestine security organizations that were encrusted in the state itself.
Una segunda etapa que constituyó la creación de las herramientas para el funcionamiento de CICIG, fortalecimiento del Ministerio Público y del sistema de justicia.
And the second phase included the founding of the work to get going and the establishment of relationships with the public ministry in order to launch the mission.
En esta segunda etapa, también actores sumamente valiosos para el país, Claudia Paz y Paz, los comisionados que estuvieron en Guatemala, equipo de fiscales, jueces e incluso diputados al Congreso de la República.
And so included in that stage were important towering figures such as Claudia Paz y Paz, the commissioners of CICIG at the time, as well as certain members of Congress and some judges at the time, as well as the prosecutors themselves in the public ministry.
Se genera todo un marco normativo, la ley contra la delincuencia organizada, la ley de competencia de mayor riesgo,
framework, including the law against organized crime,
la ley de mayor riesgo,
the law of lesser risk,
y se empiezan a generar unidades importantes dentro del Ministerio Público.
and then began creating these institutions, new institutions, capacities within the Attorney General's office.
La unidad de métodos especiales, la dirección de análisis criminal,
The unit for special methods, the unit of criminal analysis that was already mentioned,
la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad en Guatemala.
and the special prosecutorial office against impunity in Guatemala.
Las primeras dos unidades constituyen hoy día el cerebro del Ministerio Público.
So those first two of those three units constitute the brains of the public ministry.
Y la Fiscalía Especial contra la Impunidad es la contraparte de CICIG y está integrada por más de 100 fiscales expertos.
And the third office, the special prosecutorial unit that works with against impunity, that works with CICIG, consists now of over 100 trained prosecutors.
Una tercera etapa donde aparecemos el comisionado Iván Velázquez y yo como fiscal general de Guatemala, que utilizamos esas herramientas que nos han dejado tanto los comisionados anteriores como Claudia Paz y el Congreso de la República con la voluntad de algunos diputados.
And then we have a third stage in which we have a new commissioner come in, Iván Velázquez, as well as myself as the Attorney General, and we're able to take advantage of the tools that were left behind by the previous Attorney General, Claudia Paz y Paz, as well as the laws that were passed by the Guatemalan Congress.
En esta etapa ya podemos hablar de profundizar en las investigaciones de los diversos casos.
And so in this stage we were able to deepen the investigations and prosecutions in various cases.
Pero también de la capacidad instalada que está dejando CICIG en el país.
But at the same time, I'm sorry.
Capacidad instalada.
And so we also had installed and strengthened capacities that were being created within the country with the support of CICIG.
Y por razón del tiempo me voy a referir solo a la Dirección de Análisis Criminal.
And so for reasons of time, I'm just going to focus on one example, which is this criminal analysis direction or office.
Cuando yo tomé posesión como fiscal general, había un gran esfuerzo en la creación de esta dirección de análisis criminal. Habían guatemaltecos trabajando y capacitándose, pero también estaban dentro de esta dirección especialistas de CICIG.
And so when I first came into the Office of Attorney General, there were already several people, specialists, working within this criminal analysis unit, being trained and learning Guatemalans, but also specialists from CICIG.
3 años después, el Ministerio Público le daba analistas a la CICIG, guatemaltecos, para que trabajaran con CICIG.
3 years later, this unit lent its own Guatemalan specialists from this unit to CICIG to do the work that they were carrying out jointly.
Y luego las investigaciones de casos como La Línea, cooptación del Estado guatemalteco y otros casos que han trascendido nacional e internacionalmente.
And helped win the investigations of cases like La Línea that was already mentioned, as well as cooptation of the state and other important cases.
Esta es, a mi juicio, la tercera etapa y hay una última etapa que está pendiente.
That was the third stage, and now we're to the fourth stage that's still unfolding.
Y que no me cabe la menor duda, a pesar de los esfuerzos de la impunidad y esfuerzos contra la corrupción que hay en el país,
I don't have any doubt that despite the forces that are working against, that are working in favor of impunity and corruption in the country,
esta cuarta etapa se tiene que cumplir en algún momento de la historia de Guatemala.
this fourth stage will have to reach its fulfillment in the history of Guatemala.
El acuerdo de creación de CICIG refiere todo este proceso de fortalecimiento del sistema de justicia de Guatemala.
The agreement that created CICIG refers specifically to this creation of strengthened institutional capacities of the Guatemalan state
Para luchar contra los cuerpos ilegales de seguridad y aparatos clandestinos de seguridad incrustados en el Estado guatemalteco,
to work against these illegal clandestine security groups that are encrusted inside the state,
que luego mutaron y se convirtieron en redes político-económicas ilícitas.
and then over time transform themselves into illegal political economic networks.
En las investigaciones vimos esa transformación y logramos ver esa transformación gracias al apoyo y al trabajo de la Comisión Internacional contra la Impunidad en Guatemala.
And in our work in the Attorney General's office, we saw firsthand this transformation of these groups with the support and the analytic support of CICIG.
Y aparentemente estamos en retroceso en este momento en el país,
Apparently we're in a stage of retreat now in the country,
pero hay una capacidad instalada y una legislación que nadie puede destruir.
but we have institutional capacity as well as laws on the books that nobody can undermine and take away.
Y a mi juicio, lo más importante, hay una cultura de legalidad que ya se instaló en el corazón y en la mente de los guatemaltecos y eso es irreversible.
And we have a culture of legality that's installed itself in the hearts and the minds of the Guatemalan people and society that is impossible to reverse.
Y esa cuarta etapa que está pendiente, de acuerdo con el acuerdo suscrito entre el Gobierno de Guatemala y Naciones Unidas, aunque finaliza en septiembre,
And this final stage, this fourth stage, even though it's about to end according to the agreement between the state and the CICIG in September,
nos indica que debemos de asegurarnos de la no reaparición de los cuerpos ilegales de seguridad y aparatos clandestinos de seguridad. Eso es lo que está pendiente en Guatemala.
suggests that we need to continue to commit ourselves to the non-reappearance of these illegal clandestine armed security groups in Guatemalan society.
Y aunque ahora el Ministerio Público esté en modo vigilancia,
And although
en vigilancia sin actuar,
el Estado, I'm sorry,
el Ministerio Público.
although the Attorney General's office is being vigilant right now,
Pasivo.
is being passively vigilant right now,
Y hay pasividad en todo el país, eso no quiere decir que la otra etapa debe de realizarse.
this doesn't mean that this fourth stage cannot realize its ultimate
Y en ese sentido,
achievements.
indudablemente se requiere mucho apoyo de la sociedad guatemalteca
And in this sense, it requires the support of multiple sectors within Guatemalan society
y de la comunidad internacional.
and of the international community.
Hay que preparar protocolos, hay que reflexionar sobre las buenas prácticas
To prepare protocols and reflect on best practices.
y es sumamente importante empezar a preparar esa cuarta etapa para cuando el momento político lo permita, implementarla en el país.
And we have to prepare ourselves for when the conditions permit for this fourth stage to be implemented, to be prepared to do so.
Así es de que ni siquiera estamos de rodillas, estamos en pie, tratando de rescatar la democracia en Guatemala desde cualquier espacio dentro del país o quienes hemos sido forzados a salir de Guatemala.
And so we're working hard, we're on our feet, working and standing up to this situation, whether we are inside Guatemala or even those of us who are forced to be outside of Guatemala.
El Estado de Derecho en Guatemala y luchar por la gente pobre merece cualquier sacrificio. Muchas gracias.
The state of rule of law is something that needs to be fought for, and so thank you very much for this opportunity.
Muchísimas gracias. We want to thank Fiscal General Aldana, our guests, Arturo, Chuck, and obviously Fiscal General Claudia Paz y Paz, who's now on a plane someplace, going someplace from Costa Rica, and thank all of you.